So what they get to is that the moon was made by So I am back with another book review, and this one scored pretty bad. I didn't want this to be super long like usual because I did enjoy the book, so it's kind of like, no offense, but I don't want to give this book a lot of my time. Who Built the Moon is the title of this book. This is what the cover looks like, and it's by Christopher Knight and Alan Butler, two authors who co-wrote this book. Either I'm not doing my research properly, or like just any random person can write a book. When I look these people up, I expect to find at least something from recent, if they're still alive, something from recent, or like at least a backstory, what school you went to, something slight, you get what I'm saying? Something. I could barely find anything on these two guys. They're from the UK, I believe, and honestly, it's going to be a very quick background on both of these authors. Christopher Knight was born in 1950. He has worked in marketing, advertising, and public relations. He joined the Freemasons in 1976 and grew interested in studying their rituals and history, which led to Knight writing the bestseller, The Hiram Key. He has continued his study of rituals through time, which has been since labeled as pseudoscience. Chris and Alan introduce a great deal of incontrovertible evidence of supporting their earlier assumptions regarding use of ancient measuring systems, and also expose what can only be described as a conspiracy at the very heart of the United States to make Washington, D.C. the center of a new world order that has been planned for centuries. In short, these guys, I guess, this is the first book I read by them. Apparently they have more. I don't know how many more, but they do have more books together trying to go over the details of early human civilization. I put a poll out there asking everyone to choose a book for me to read, at least a genre, and conspiracy won the competition. So this was my version of picking a conspiracy book, and it turned out to be more of like historical science about the moon. And I'm so bad, and I do these videos from like a standpoint of like an American whose brain is slowly deteriorating from social media. So I don't remember all the details. This book, in short, kind of starts off with the history of the moon and like the earliest findings from like or early civilizations. They would find old carvings and portraits of women holding like crescent moons in one hand, and like their pregnant bellies in another hand. Authors start off explaining how in history, anthropologists have found these early carvings, self-portraits at that, so they were made by women, of them and their relationship with the moon. So they just kind of put out there that there was a base understanding of what the moon was and what it meant to people in earlier times. Although they didn't have the technology and the schooling that we have now, they knew more than what people know today. Yeah, they start there from like what anthropologists have found in carvings and with stones, and how they're geometrically set up and how they're measured, and everything was so accurate. And I guess the biggest question that they pose is, how do these prehistoric people have such accurate measurements, and these items, these ancient relics and discoveries are not placed in random places. They're all strategically placed, so they had some sort of computation and comprehension of how at least the cosmos and the astros worked. So it goes from there, and it kind of goes through history, what people have known about the moon. So it goes over Galileo, how he got his first telescope, and all of the philosophers before him and after him, and eventually we get to Russia and America fighting to get to the moon. Who's going to get to the moon first? So the space race, and then we get to the actual moon landing, and then they get to their conclusion of, okay, who built the actual moon? Their explanation for how science, and there is no explanation, there's no official explanation. How he explains it is that science just goes with the best theory, and until somebody can debunk and replace it, that theory will just remain the theory until it's debunked and replaced. How theory started off back in the day was that obviously kind of when religion governed most of everybody's views, it was kind of like a God put the moon there, we can't question it. What was done by the creator pretty much. And people went along with that because they didn't have the knowledge to seek out furthermore. And people started believing kind of like the Big Bang and things like that. So they started believing what science said. How the authors present the information is they feel people are kind of softened to the idea that the moon may have not been made by this invisible creator, or in my own words, they kind of see that as like a cop-out, you saying, oh, the creator made the moon just because there's no other explanation for it. So what they get to is that the moon was made by aliens. Okay, that's they shorten it, they abbreviate it to a UCA. So what they get to is that the moon was made by, which is unknown creative agency, I believe, aliens, God, whatever you want to call it, some unknown species. The moon obviously has effect on human behavior down here on Earth, has effect on our waters and the tides, it has effect on women's menstrual cycles. This is where the word like lunatic comes from. People's behavior change. I guess I'm just going to get into the actual review. And before I get into the rating of the book, a couple themes that I found in the book, and no, I will not explain, or I might explain, it all depends. The things I found throughout the book were enigma. And let's look up the definition of enigma. An enigma is a person or thing that is mysterious, puzzling, or difficult to understand, or so they tell us. And I don't say that with conviction, but I say it with conviction because it's really, or so they tell us, because they might know something and they might not know anything, but we're told what we're told, which at the end of the day is a theory. So as they tell us, the moon has been an enigma since the beginning of time, except for these women who were carving these portraits, self-portraits at that, into walls and what have you. They clearly had some type of understanding that we don't have today. Up until today, from what they tell us, it's very, very mystical and mysterious. Unnatural was another kind of theme that I found. Unnatural, even the authors of this book, that the moon itself is unnatural. It's made up of, and I'm paraphrasing, I was very bad at science and astronomy and what have you, but it's made up of some of the same particles that the earth is made out of, but it has less. So the earth has more minerals inside of its crust, and the moon has some of those items, but not all of them. And yet the moon is just as old as the earth. So how could the moon not have the same? I guess that's the question, is how could something so similar in age and has all these coincidental measurements, like it's supposedly 400 times away from the sun, but it's also 1/400th the size of the earth. So there's a lot of numbers that just match up. And so the author's argument is whoever made this assumed that eventually humans would be counting on base 10 to end up with these measurements, because whoever made this moon with all these coincidental measurements, this distance away from the sun, this size of the earth, those are the types of measurements that were provided. There were a lot of ancient measurements going on here that were adding up to base 10, which is what we as humans use to measure. So it seemed pretty calculated how the moon was set up. It didn't seem that it was random, is what the author's argument is. The authors of this book who built the moon, Christopher and Alan, they insinuating that there's some type of message by the creator of the moon. Whoever put it there wanted us to know that they made it. And so the question is, how far back in time did they go to actually make this? How did they know we'd be able to discover it? How did they know that we'd be counting in this denomination? And in retrospect to how long the earth has been here, and how long humans have been here, and how long technology or knowledge has been here, humans got this information about how to read and write and tools and technology, etc. We got this pretty recently in history, like compared to the whole timeline. We got this fairly recently. So whoever made it had to have visited us within this recent time period to do all of this divine intervention. This book raises a lot of questions, to me personally especially. One that is not mentioned in the book, a theme that's not mentioned, but it raises even more questions, is time, the aspect of time. As far as we know, if we're calculating time in like BC, BCE, what have you, what happens when you get so far past that time, there's no number for it? How long really is recorded time? Like if someone were to time travel, right, and there wasn't a specific date, how would you get to and fro or from and to these time parameters that we have. So if you wanted to go back to the beginning of time, there's no number for that. How do you calculate for that older time? But yes, it brought up that conundrum in my mind, although it was not the aspect, the central aspect of the book. And it was bad. I'm sorry. I gave it a bad review. I didn't give it a bad review. It gave itself a bad review. I really dragged on this book because about a quarter of the way through, I started to think to myself, like, man, these people are, it's not that they're lying, but like, I don't disagree or agree with their theories, but something inside of me just doesn't believe it. So it doesn't matter what type of book you read. It could come off as nonfiction. It could come off as fiction. It could come off as whatever you want it to come off as, and it's still up to you whether or not to believe it. I chose not to believe this book. And again, I chose this book because I thought it was more conspiracy, but it's more historical science, astrology. It was kind of boring. They mention a part towards the end. There's about 14 chapters, and towards the 12th chapter, it starts to mention like conspiracy theorists say, and that's the part that got my attention. And I think I bookmarked those pages. First rating is about the storyline and the ending. The storyline and the ending, I gave it a thumbs down, honestly. Out of all 14 chapters, it takes until the 12th, 13th-ish chapter to actually get into the meat and potatoes of where this is going. So you have about 200 pages of just straight historical, scientific, this is what people thought during the Renaissance era type past history information. So it's pretty boring, honestly, especially if I went into this thinking I was going to read more conspiratorial information, and it's just like reading a school science textbook. I gave it a thumbs down, honestly. And even in the ending, they hint that it's aliens, but they didn't give like a specific aliens did it this way. I would at least like them to theorize, okay, if you thought it was aliens, well, how did you think these aliens did it? They just kind of leave it off at, well, anything is possible. Time travel is possible. It could have been a time traveling human that put this moon here. I gave it a thumbs down, honestly. I gave it a thumbs down. The next category is the length and the pace. I gave it a thumbs up mainly because any book under 250, 2 thumbs up with me. This was about 225 pages, not including the appendix in the back. I think there was like 4 or 5 appendixes. I did not read them. Besides that, there are pictures in the middle. This is what they look like, of the earth, of the sun, of lightning. They even put a picture of like the moon landing in here, which, look at that spacecraft. Look at that craft. I don't know. The author goes as far as to even saying the authors say that they believe that the moon landing was real. When was this book written? Because there's a movie coming out with Channing Tatum and Scarlett Johansson about them making the moon landing. 2005. I believe everything conspiracy theorists say because it could all be true. I believe everything besides what I've been told. So if you kind of reaffirm what I've been told, then my soul tells me that I shouldn't believe you. So that's where I was at with the book. It's about 225 pages. They have some pictures in the middle, and the chapters are not too long, but it's almost like it's double spaced. So there's a lot of diagrams and stuff. It's very sciencey. But yeah, I give it a thumbs up. So the next category is complexity, and again, it is very sciencey, very historical. I had to pop my dictionary out a few times, multiple times, a handful of times. And honestly, the average person, which I guess I'm thinking for Black people, it's almost 1 in every 2 people. So I can comprehend it, the next Black person will not. So it's a little complex if you feel like you're not on the reading level, I guess, that you should be. Or if you're just a person that doesn't read that often, it's a little complex. Unless you want to give yourself that challenge, then go ahead, and I guess it's a little fun reading about someone's theory on something. Doesn't make it a conspiracy, it just makes it a theory. But yeah, complexity, it wasn't pretty complex, but it was just a base complex. Like, it wasn't simple. If it's not simple, it's complex. Would you read another book by the author? I initially gave this one a thumbs down. I'm not gonna lie. I initially gave this a thumbs down, and I still have a thumbs down right now. I literally just changed it as I was talking. What I wrote as to why I didn't want to read another book is because After reading his titles, I was interested, but then I started to read this one and just felt a little deceived, thinking it would somewhat be conspiracy, somewhat enlightening. It just felt like a book doubling down on what we learned in school about astrology, plus the realization that extraterrestrial life force was behind it. This book really felt like school, to be honest. It didn't feel fun at all. I gave it a thumbs down initially. Would I read another book by them just because this felt sciencey? I want to say I would read another book just because I like giving people the benefit of the doubt, and their other books sound actually interesting, like about Freemasonry and about early civilization or history, whatever you want to call it. So I guess I just now change it to a yes. I just barely did that because initially it was a no. The last category is, would I recommend it? I said no. For sure, for this one, I said no. It was honestly kind of a bore, like I keep saying, unless you're into the astros and how the moon works. This was about the moon, and just the history of the moon, at least what scientists have gathered so far and confirmed. This is for you. If you like the moon and planets, I would say to get this book. I'm into information, but this just felt, like I said, once again, like doubling down on what we learned in school. Unless anything that I've said interests you, then that's up to you, but I would say no. It wasn't like eye-opening, especially in 2024 when we know there's a bunch of weird stuff going on, but this was written in 2005, so this was probably very controversial back then, but today this is kind of like a Out of everything, it got 2 stars. Initially it was only going to get 1 star. I just now, as I did this review, flipped it to get 2 stars. So this was 2 stars. I'm not sure if this is the lowest rating that I've gave thus far, but I think it deserves to be just a little bit. So I wrote down some quick facts and I kind of tagged some quick favorite quotes or pages, and then I'm getting out of here. A couple quick facts. The first one: early carvings found in caves depict a pregnant woman with a hand on abdomen, the other hand holding a moon. Strong inference that ancient civilizations associated the moon with fertility. They were self-portraits, and women became self-conscious of the fertility process and were tracking and planning like scientists. If y'all haven't read the book, The Great Cosmic Mother, I think I want to choose that book to go, not next, but like maybe 2 or 3 books down the line. The Great Cosmic Mother is exactly what that line just talked about, and how women, specifically Black and indigenous women to like Southern America, were the first everything. The first scientists, the first farmers, the first teachers, the first gatherers and hunters, whatever you want to call it. They were the first. So another quick fact is there was a switch from major female moon-based deities to male solar-based deities around the time of Egypt. Also comes at the point they created writing. They found out what papyrus was, which is paper, and the evolution of writing involved the use of the left hemisphere brain function compared to earlier times where the right hemisphere was used. Women ran society earlier, before like pharaohs in Egypt and things, and then they came through and they started worshiping kings and the sun and man. So before that, women ran society and they worshipped the moon, not the sun, but the moon, nature, and pretty much like nurturing and love. When women were in charge, I guess anthropologists have found that the right hemisphere of the brain was more used when women were in charge, and that's in charge of your creativity and your intuitiveness. And the left hemisphere, once kings and pharaohs came along, is in charge of like they call it your reptilian brain. So when you're stuck in like a fear and survival mode, that's what came along once men started ruling. The moon goddess is noted as the first major deity that was ever found, the moon goddess, and it represents fertilities, and it's representative of females because, again, the menstrual cycle kind of lines up with the moon phases. This book also admits that after World War II, USA worked with German rocket scientists to compete with Russia, who were creating bombs and weaponized rocket launchers. Sputnik satellite, made by the Russians, was successfully placed into upper atmosphere, twice with a dog being passenger, and the dog did pass away because they couldn't get the spacecrafts back. When they first started building them, they just sent them up and they couldn't get them back. So they sent a dog just to see if life could survive on the craft, and it did, but it couldn't get back down. My point in even writing that note down was the part about the US working with Germans to beat Russia. Those were the Nazis. I don't know if you guys know that. I have another book too. It's called Operation Paperclip, and it's about how most of them did not get convicted, and the US actually brought them over, and we started using them to compete in the space race, or in science, whatever you want to call it. And that's where NASA begins, is with Werner von Braun, and he's best friends with Walt Disney. He was best friends with Walt Disney. It does mention how we in the US brought over those German soldiers, or scientists, sorry, not soldiers, scientists. Another thing they brought up was how JFK felt the pressure of the space race against Russia, and then he put a deadline for scientists to get a rocket landed on the moon surface with people in it. He gave NASA pretty much a deadline to get a rocket up. NASA barely met this deadline. So that's why people found it kind of weird when we actually did make it to the moon, is because this whole time they were saying that they couldn't get the spacecrafts to the moon. They were having so much trouble of stuff blowing up and what have you. And then this deadline comes up and all of a sudden they made it to the moon. So it's very questionable, the timing of the whole moon landing back then. And I showed y'all a picture. If you have not seen it, go look it up for yourself. The picture of the craft that landed on the moon could not have, even do your own research on the space landing, the moon landing. I won't even put my ideas into your mind, but there's a lot of questions and holes that we need to figure out. We, at this point, science knows that possibly some unknown agency put the moon into our atmosphere to orbit us and also have effects on our gravity here on the land, on our water at least. Scientists know that, and what they have been pretty much doing is sending out radio wave signals into space, and knowing how long it takes to travel from point A to point B in space, which could take millions of billions of years. The authors pretty much state they don't know how that would make sense to try to reach out to other intelligent life, because how would they know to listen out for our radio signals at this exact time, and how long it would even take for anyone to receive that message and for us to receive one back. But yeah, to keep it basics, what this book at least admitted was that, one, the moon is unnatural, which I believe. A couple facts that the book didn't mention that I'm just going to mention. The moon emits negative energies. So the sun gives out photon energy. It's positive. It's a positive charge. So the moon gives out negative charges, hence the word lunatic and why some people go crazy and it has effects on behavior. But the sun promotes life. It's a positive charge. So they're pretty much opposites. Theorists say that without the moon, our tide would be so high we would only be able to live on like mountaintops and stuff, because the water would be covering the land without this moon here orbiting us to keep it under wraps, which is debatable. It's just a theory, but that's what they say anyway. I'm going to read a few passages. This is a passage they brought up about Stanley Kubrick and him possibly filming the moon landing on a Hollywood set. This is what they say. It says, at the time of Clark and Kubrick's film was first capturing the imagination of a generation, no human had yet reached the moon. But the following year, with less than 6 months to go in the late President Kennedy's deadline, Commander Neil Armstrong stepped out onto the surface of the moon on July 20th, 1969, with his famous but slightly misdelivered line, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." At this point, we must mention that there are some people who seriously believe that NASA faked the moon landings on a film set, just like the one used by Stanley Kubrick. The evidence they produce looks reasonable at a casual glance, assuming you know nothing at all about photography or the facts relating to our lunar condition. These ideas suddenly leaped into the public imagination on February 15th, 2001, when Fox Television broadcasted a program called Conspiracy Theory: Did We Land on the Moon? The author goes on to pretty much refute that it was a conspiracy, that they believe we actually landed. Do your own research. In this part of the text, they start mentioning Egyptians and Sumerians. In the previous book, Civilization 1, we speculated that the earliest records of the Sumerians and the ancient Egyptians were actually correct when they claimed that their own civilizations had been instructed in the arts and scientists by an external agency. In these records, there are references to people called the Watchers, who taught geometry, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and other sciences. The indigenous population did not know where these people had come from, and they described them as having superhuman powers, although they were clearly human beings and not gods. And then it goes on to say how people of like Egyptian and Sumerian areas in India and Asia were also making all these great structures at the same time. They all got this knowledge to start building superior artifacts all around the world without technology, supposedly. Also, the pyramids were built from top down, not from bottom up, if you didn't know that. So that's another, the book doesn't go over that, but how do humans get this type of information so recently in history? How does this just come out of nowhere? Mind you, they just said indigenous peoples mention that the watchers came out of the sky and gave them this technology. It wasn't just that humans figured it out. Someone came down and gave it to them. So that's documented history, and I assume, right, like they're saying Egypt, they're talking about Africans, and that's what kind of made me want to say that I want to read their previous books, because I'm interested in what white people have documented about Black people or African ancient history, because they really wanted to give us all the information about our history, they would, but obviously if we had it all, something would change. Somebody thought Africans was special enough to have this type of technological information in order to better their civilizations, and yet somehow, somewhere, it all got wiped out and we don't know how to do it anymore. Another interesting point that the book makes is about CERN. If you don't know, CERN is the European Center for Nuclear Research. And what the book says is, amazingly, scientists are becoming increasingly confident they will be able to create black holes on demand using new atom smashers due to come online in 2007. That was 17 years ago. It's believed that the new Large Hadron Collider, the LHC, being built astride the Franco-Swiss border of West Geneva by the CERN Center, will be able to create black holes at the rate of 1 per second. The LHC is an accelerator which will bombard protons and antiprotons together with such a force that the collision will create temperatures and energy densities not seen since the first trillionth second after the Big Bang. So that's interesting. People are making black holes. And the next quote is about human DNA. So pretty much, I guess science is trying to figure out, well, if they hit a message in the moon, whoever this unknown creator is, maybe they hit a message somewhere else. But where would they hide another message? It would have to be somewhere where it would not deteriorate over so much time, and somewhere where we could obviously look into and know how to read it, pretty much. So they came to the conclusion that, hey, DNA is pretty much almost indestructible. Information passes down from one generation to the next through or via your DNA. So whatever your ancestors have collected informationally, it travels to you as their descendant. So this is where scientists start getting the DNA that maybe we should start trying to read DNA. And specifically, there's a place where some DNA cells will go to be specifically protected from deterioration. Only some cells. And so scientists thought, well, we'll start there with those cells, the ones that are being protected by this bodily source that's protecting them. So what they did in a group of mice is they started messing with or removing those DNA genes that were being covered or protected, and they saw if maybe this would kind of affect the mice, and it didn't, supposedly. And so pretty much what this book was saying is that the Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, was a 13-year mission to unravel the secrets of the minute data stored that carries all of the information needed to make a human being, what we call DNA. The key goals of the project were to, 1, identify all the genes in human DNA, which there are believed to be approximately up to 25,000 genes. And secondly is to determine the sequences of 3 billion chemical base pairs that make up DNA. So they're pretty much thinking they want information. They want the information that's in the DNA of a human being. And this is how I want to end it. I'm going to read this last little piece from the book. This is my last quote, and I'll wrap it up. What it says here in this almost last chapter is that we have noted that through ancient history, different civilizations have recorded that people with superpowers arrived from nowhere to teach humanity about the sciences. Then we noted how all the parallel developments that occurred around the world in unconnected locations happened at the same time. We would have to conclude that people will travel back to points in history, such as the era around 3100 BC, when several civilizations from South America to North Africa to Asia to Europe were suddenly emerging and building similar structures at the same time, with no internet to say, yo, let's build this at 2 o'clock. They did it all at the same time, with the same information, with almost the same tools and building strategies. It seems probable that the megalithic structures that have lunar alignments and use the unit that describes the dimensions of the moon were deliberately designed and left to point the way forward. We do not know yet whether the detailed message is indeed inside the protected sections of DNA, but wherever it is, the initial message was only recognized because of all of those megalithic structures extending their weathered and ancient stone fingers to the night sky. Look at 2 stars out of 5. This was written in 2005. I don't know if I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, being that on their websites, I think I found this information that these two authors, at least one of the two, entered into the Freemason society because he was just curious. So being that he's in that society, he should know at least a little bit more than we do. Maybe he can't prove it on paper, which is why, I mean, in science, maybe that's why he can't, with conviction, say what he thinks that it is. He can only throw it out there as a theory. But I wanted more definite evidence. I wanted him to say, this is what it is. This is what I think based on my research. This is what it is, I'm sure. He is kind of waiting for the science community to back him before he feels validated. This is what I get coming off of the writing style, is that they are waiting from validation from the whole science community before they actually confirm whether or not their theory is true, that aliens made the moon. In my opinion, I feel like, yes, they are telling us that some type of alien, if that's what you want to call it, extraterrestrial, not from this land, created the moon. I agree. I also agree there's something in the DNA. Maybe it has to do with the moon, maybe it doesn't, but there's something there. Indigenous people, they would not lie about people coming out of the sky. That was true. Only thing else I can say is I felt incomplete. I felt almost a little misled that this would be conspiracy, although it might be to some people. Yeah, it's gonna go back on my shelf, and I'm probably never gonna. I like books where I can, even if it is conspiracy, I have conspiracy books that I can go back and reread because there's some people's names, dates, historical situations that I want to remember and keep in the back of my mind for like a quick reference if I need it. This is something that I probably won't even think twice about picking up again. I saw a couple of these actually at like the thrift store. Whenever I see a book at the thrift store, it almost makes me feel a little bad. The person obviously didn't think it was good enough to keep. And I don't feel bad when I see it, but like I feel when I see books that I own in the actual thrift store is that it was so bad they had to go out and sell it. I think this was one of those books because I'm telling you, I saw maybe like 10 copies of these books in the thrift store, in one thrift store, all stacked next to each other. It was very sciencey, very historical, so it wasn't like it was science fiction. I think it was supposed to be based in nonfiction. Yeah, I'll probably read something. I'll probably do the next choice of book. I have been wanting to read something a little bit more about aliens, maybe, or something about like I said, the Great Cosmic Mother, which is about, supposedly it's based in history or historical fact. And I've honestly been trying to get myself to pick up like a romance book, something I said that I would never read ever, but I think I'm gonna have to. And I don't read books that are on trend. I read probably the opposite of books that are on trend. Like people probably wouldn't want to ever pick up the books that I read, but that's okay. This book was not my favorite at all. Probably the lowest rated book that I've read so far. I didn't want to get through it. It took me a month to get through it, although it probably should have took me only like 2 weeks max. But yeah, I dragged my feet, and yeah, I hope to never have to pick it up again. Thank you guys for watching, and hopefully I'll make another video sooner than later. I did pick up another book already, and yeah, I'll see you guys on my next video. Bye. Bye, YouTube.